So without any further ado, I'm going to move on to introducing our speaker for tonight. Rabbi Aaron is originally from Manchester, where after studying for his A-levels, he learned in Talmudical colleges in London, Israel, and New York. It was in these breakout years that he realised it was possible to live in a place where it doesn't always rain, though I don't think the Northeast is living up to that tonight, unfortunately. However, missing the Manchester weather so much, he came back to Manchester to take up his first rabbinic post in Sale in 2004. Aaron holds a master's degree in religions and theology, gained at the University of Manchester, from where he graduated with a distinction. In 2011, Rabbi Aaron moved to the Northeast for a 4-year stint as rabbi at the United Hebrew Congregation of Newcastle. 12 years later, he is still here and quietly praying that no one notices and thinks he has outstayed his welcome. He's also the student chaplain for Durham, Newcastle, Northumbria and Teesside universities, and is active on the Northeast Interfaith Circuit and is chair of the Newcastle Council of Faiths. Aaron is married to Miriam and they have 5 children. His claim to fame is having a name that sounds like a designer brand and for being the only plane-spotting rabbi in the Northeast, which is much cooler and more exciting than you might otherwise think. So I am now going to hand over to Aaron and mute myself and disappear, but I will be here for the rest of the talk and we'll see you at the end for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lizzie. And thank you also to the team that are responsible for running the Lahav Jewish Heritage Project. They do so with professionalism and with fidelity to the aims and aspirations of the Lahav of blessed memory. And I'm indebted to the project for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And of course, thank you everyone for coming along tonight. In today's world of academia, it's accepted and expected that people speak from their own biases and experiences. So please bear that in mind as I talk, because I'm sure the way I present the topic in terms of selection and the way I talk about them may not be the way that you would, given your particular circumstances. So what's important for you to know how to judge what I'm about to tell you? Well, first, I'm going to talk quite a lot about history, but I'm not a historian. I'm an observant Jew with an interest in history. I'm not intending to theorize too much, because I may speculate on 1 or 2 points, and if I do, I'll try and alert you to that so that you can take it with a pinch of salt if you so wish. Also, I'd really rather spend far more time in conversation with you than talking at you. So to this end, I hope we can have a meaningful discussion after the married months. And whether this is your first time interacting with a rabbi or whether that's something you do all the time, please feel free to ask anything at all, at least anything at all that there's a chance I might know something about. And I'll try and answer honestly and openly. I'm going to share my screen now. Which, given the wonders of modern technology, I can do thusly. No, not from that one. Let's see. Sorry about that. Now, I'm going to be 10 things down in the crucible. I'm sorry about this, everyone. Moving that way and get the view. There we go. Okay, good to go. So, thank you for your patience. So, this talk is called A Light Unto the Nations, Judaism for Jordan. You were glad to hear that I don't intend selling Judaism to you as the one true way to have a meaningful relationship with God. There isn't one. Of course, if you're born to a Jewish mother or fully choose to convert to Judaism, then Judaism has plenty to say to you about how you live your life. But this talk is about 2 things, neither of which are that. The first is to build a conceptual model of what being a light to the nations means. And the second will be a historical overview of the beginnings of the Jewish community in the Northeast. And specifically with focus on the Gateshead Jewish community. And then to wrap up by considering how well the Gateshead community does as a light unto the nations. So nothing controversial there at all. So where does the phrase come from and what does it mean? Well, the first of those questions is much easier to answer than the second. The term originates in Isaiah, in fact, and it occurs 3 times. Allow me to show you. The first is here in chapter 42, God says, Ani Hashem, I'm God. I called you with righteousness, and I'll strengthen your hand. And I formed you and I made you for a people's covenant, for a light to the nations. And then he goes on in chapter 49, and he said, it is too light for you to be my servant. This is God speaking. It is too light for you to be my servant, to establish the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the besieged of Israel. But I will make you a light of nations, so that my salvation shall be till the end of the earth. And then finally, a few chapters later, towards the end of Isaiah, we read this, and the nations shall go by your light, and kings by the brilliance of your shine. Now, I find Isaiah, or Yeshaya, as he's called in the Jewish world, very difficult to understand and to read. And to be honest, those three verses are also pretty difficult. But there are commentators who have done far better than I ever could, and they've asked what this means, and they've plumbed the depths in this way. They suggest as follows: that Jews have a religious, a moral, and ethical duty to demonstrate what an inspirational and meaningful relationship with God looks like. Not to turn anyone Jewish, but so that in their own lives, people who observe Jews can comprehend how they can build a wholesome relationship with God. Now, in practice, for most of Jewish history, certainly up until the 20th century, Jews were in no position to demonstrate anything of the sort. The anti-Semitism and persecution that followed Jews around Europe, Africa, and the Middle East for almost 1800 years didn't really allow for any sort of enlightened spiritual conversation with the world around them, apart from the occasional one where the Jew was given the choice between conversion or death. One of my favourite Jewish history books by Bernard Kopp takes its title from a midrashic phrase, "Lo miduftech, lo miuksech," neither your honey nor your stink. And what he's trying to say is that for most of our history, we've asked the world, don't try and be nice to us, don't be mean to us, just please leave us alone. It was an isolationism that was born of suffering, and going through that, you can imagine being a light to the nations was kind of parked and forgotten about. And then the world started to change, perhaps not quickly enough for some since the Enlightenment, and increasingly over the last 150 years, though, we have seen a change in Western attitudes towards minorities and others, and certainly including Jews. And in so doing, Jews have started to find their voices. And this idea of being a light unto the nations has been revived. Modern Orthodoxy, a version of Judaism that seeks to blend modernity with tradition, has adopted the term almost as its slogan. Its principal exponent, Rabbi Shimshon Hirsch, who incidentally applied to become the chief rabbi of the UK in 1843, he made it to the final round of 4 out of 13 applicants, but he only managed to secure 2 out of a possible 135 votes in that round. So that wasn't an overwhelming endorsement, so he didn't get the job. But he saw it as a crucial part of the mission of the modern Jew. So what is the mission? So I've already described it in passive terms, that Jews ought to feel a sense of responsibility, to be role models to others. And that's in keeping with the parable of light. It shines and illuminates, but it only reveals what's already there. It doesn't create. But the Torah, the foundational book of living that starts with the 5 biblical books of Moses, but in its wider sense means the hundreds of thousands of books of commentary that have been written since, that in some way reflect back onto the original Torah, onto the original 5 books. So in there we see that a different mission, that Jews have to take responsibility and to play a more dynamic role. And in brief, there are 7 commandments called mitzvot that the Torah sees as the underpinning of society, and these are considered to be universal laws. They apply to all societies, to all people, and in truth, most societies, at least the most successful ones, already endorse a version of these rules, if not all of them, then certainly most of them. The rules are called the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, 7 Noahide laws, and here they are. So, as you can see, I'm not going to read through the entire slide, but the highlighted words, the words in bold, to have a system of justice, not to blaspheme, not to have idolatry, no illicit relationship, no homicide, no theft, and eating the limb of a living creature, which expands into being considerate of animals and, in fact, the environment. So these are things that the Torah suggests are ways in which the society can live and do well. And in fact, these are called the Noahide laws because they were given to Noah. Noah was not a Jew. Noah lived before Abraham, and Abraham was the first Jew. So these were laws the Torah wished the entire world to abide by. So we've got a couple of ways in which Jews can be a light to the nations. The first is by living a life dedicated to the precepts of the Torah. And by the way, a Jew has 613 commandments, not just 7. And to demonstrate through their conduct and demeanor that building good interpersonal skills and growing good communities and deepening our relationship with God is a force for good and positivity. That's the first way. The second way is by encouragement when circumstances allow, and in particular with regard to the 7 Noahide laws. Okay, so that's the end of part 1. Let's delve into the history of the Newcastle Jewish community. I'm sure for some of you, some of what I'm going to say is going to be quite familiar. I'm sure you're quite well versed, but it's always good to have a revamp, and found them quite interesting nuggets along the way, hopefully. So there's evidence of a Jewish presence in Newcastle going way back to the 12th century. Around that time, there was a street that was called Dewgate, which suggests that there were Jews here, although I have to say, in the interest of balance, that some historians question whether it really existed at all. The street in question was known as Silver Street, which was also tenuously linked possibly to Jews being silversmiths, but possibly not. And the gate, the street, is also known as All Hallows Gate. So who knows? But there's a suggestion that there were Jews there. In any event, whether there were or there weren't, in 1290, Jews were expelled from the entire England, and that included Newcastle. And so by that point, there were no Jews left in Newcastle. Not that you take it personally, you understand. Okay, and then in 1656, Jews were readmitted under Oliver Cromwell, and this led to the re-establishment of a community in Newcastle with names of individuals starting to appear in 1775, although there are those historians who question whether these people were in fact Jewish. There's no clear evidence to suggest they were, apart from Jewish-sounding names. But what we do know is that the wood engraver Thomas Buick, who records in his memoirs that over half of his business was dedicated to servicing the needs of one customer, a guy called Isaac Hyman. Yiddish phenomenon, as they say, a Jewish name, a Watson Trinket salesman. In the late 18th and early 19th century, more Jewish names do start to appear in local trade directories. And by 1830, the first community starts to take shape. 1830, by the way, is also the first time we have a confirmed Jewish presence in the city. So those first early small group rent a room on Pilgrim Street where they would meet for prayers. At the same time, they were in negotiation to buy land for a cemetery. This was in Thornton Street, which is also in the centre of town. And you can see this tiny patch of land is now surrounded by buildings on all 4 sides. The cemetery wasn't open for very long, but members of the Jewish community still visit regularly to honour those who are there. In particular, I think you might be on, Peter Gatoff has done incredible work on all the cemeteries, but including this one. But anyway, I always take some wry amusement from the fact that the first cemetery was planned and consecrated in 1830, and the first synagogue, known as Temple Street Synagogue, which is here, was only formally established a couple of years later. So the cemetery came before the synagogue, sort of like getting your priorities in order. The numbers were small, even though they had a building. It's estimated that in 1845 there were just 33 Jews living in Newcastle, but the numbers were growing. And in fact, in 1867, the Charlotte Square Synagogue was formed as a breakaway from the Temple Street Synagogue, although that was fairly short-lived. 11 years later, in 1878, the two merged together to form the newly named Newcastle Old Hebrew Congregation, or as it's more commonly known, the Leazes Park Synagogue. Now, numbers-wise, we're now talking about quite a significant community. There were some 750 Jewish people living in Newcastle. And the new synagogue, the Leazes Park Synagogue, could accommodate 250 men and 250 women. So the minister in this slide, in the top right corner, is Reverend Solomon Baker, who was minister at Leazes Park between 1880 and 1886. This was before he joined the community. At the time he joined, he was just 22, unmarried and not ordained as a rabbi. That all came later on when he went on to serve with some distinction in the Bahamas and then Canada. The Leazes Park Synagogue closed in May 1978, whereupon it became the Leazes Arcade, the middle picture there, and later a hair and beauty salon and spa. I've tried to research that image in the middle of the picture in the middle there, because the canopy clearly says lamplighters, which fit nicely into the theme and the title of my talk, but I couldn't find anything of interest to add other than its existence. And that stained glass window, I think, looks absolutely beautiful. Wish we still had it. Okay, so it has to be said that in the late 19th century, with the exception of the chief rabbi and his court of two, forming a best-in of three, who were based in London, many of the ministers serving the Jewish communities in the UK were quite anglicised. Although, I have to say, they dressed well, with canonicals, dog collars and long gowns being the uniform of choice. In fact, some ministers would wear uniforms similar to that up until fairly recently. One of the best loved rabbis in Newcastle was Rabbi Badil, who passed away sadly a few years ago, I think 2017. And recently, when we were doing some clearing out, I found his hat, and it's one of those very similar to this picture, tall hats with, looks very cool. I don't think I could carry the look. I'm too flat for it though. Anyway, during this era, when we're going back to the late 19th century, the most competent and knowledgeable rabbis were all to be found in Europe, and any community that wanted a rabbi of that style would have to go abroad. I mentioned before, if you remember, that Professor Paul Hurt had been in the mix to be chief rabbi, and all the rabbis at that point that were being considered were from abroad. There wasn't, unfortunately, much confidence in the local talent. In fact, the first British-born rabbi to sit on the London Best-In was called Tyne Louis Mendelssohn in 1914. Now, some years before, between 1891 and 1894, then just plain old Reverend Mendelssohn, he'd served as minister of the Leazes Park Synagogue. He was the third minister to officiate there. So the ministers of the time, the synagogues that were being built, were in a way a reflection of their communities. Until the early 18th century, the oldest established communities in the UK were the Sephardic communities, although there is no record of one in Newcastle. The arrivals into the UK generally, and into the Northeast in particular, though, through the mid to late 18th century, were mainly immigrants from Ashkenaz, which was the Yiddish name for a region that encompassed northern France, Holland, Belgium, and Germany. Initially poor, and definitely treated as an underclass, the Ashkenazim were nevertheless cultured and educated Germans. One who met Isaac Hyman earlier, he was a watch and trinket salesman, a peddler of sorts. But this group of immigrants, and to an even greater extent their children, demonstrated great social mobility and started to establish businesses in wholesale and manufacturing, thereby clambering up into the middle classes. The immigrants were generally speaking selective about their religious practice. Now, from this distance, we can't judge them. The communities they left behind in Europe had been ravaged by intermarriage by incredibly large numbers of Jews converting to Christianity. But the ones who chose to leave retain their Jewish identity at all was impressive. That they wanted to build community was remarkable. That they wanted to blend into a country that was open and welcoming without special rules restricting how Jews could live and work is eminently understandable. But migration started to tail off in the mid-1800s. As we saw before, the numbers of Jews in Newcastle didn't increase dramatically, but then towards the end of the century it started again. Around 1870, the floodgates opened up. Between then and the outbreak of the Great War, 200,000 Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe migrated to the UK. They arrived in London, Liverpool, Hull, Glasgow, Newcastle, of course. In fact, every port in the country welcomed its fair share of Jews. Many of these new Russian and Eastern European immigrants were Yiddish speakers, generally Shomer Shabbat, in other words, devout in their practice and very knowledgeable, far more, you would say, devout than many of the German immigrants that has preceded them. They found the established synagogues with their cathedral-style architecture and cold, austere services not a fault of their liking, and the welcome they received from the established Jewish community, those with Germanic roots and aspirations to join the middle class of English society, was also decidedly cool. Around the UK, particularly in London, Leeds, and Manchester, the Eastern Europeans formed new communities called chevra. Chevra means a band, a group. They were much more religious and traditional than the established communities, and in many ways, they rubbed up against the establishment. as in fact would happen before too long in Gateshead. I'm referring to the rabbinic establishment, the office of the chief rabbi, the court of the chief rabbi, who rules with, you could say, with quite firm discipline. More on that later. So let's meet one of the immigrants. His name is Zachariah Bernstone, born in Lithuania, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. He left home in the mid-1870s, and after a brief stay in Sweden, where his sister had settled, took a returning coal trip from Hamburg to Newcastle. This was known as the Jewish route. It was cheap and cheerful, although perhaps not necessarily that cheerful. When he arrived, Bernstone struggled to make a living. He framed pictures, and he was also a glazier. And life for him was probably as it was for many thousands of others at the time. But he had his faith, and he was part of the community. But within a couple of years of arriving, he fell out with the Jewish community, with the Newcastle community. He wasn't satisfied with the standards of the coastal butcher. He wasn't satisfied with how it was dealt with by the authorities. He'd raised some concerns, and they weren't addressed. So in 1881, he crossed the Red Hugh Bridge and chose to live as a religious outlier. So you'll hear often, and a lot of the books that talk about these things, I've got a list of them if you're interested, that he was the first Jew to arrive in Gateshead. But there's actually a historian in Manchester, who's passed away, called Jacob Weiss, who discovered that Bernstone wasn't the first Jewish person to live in Gateshead. That distinction goes to Mr. Joseph, who lived in a big house on an estate that many years later became Saltwell Park, right where the modern Gateshead Jewish community is situated in Benton. We know he was Jewish because he subscribed to the Jewish Chronicle, which had been established in 1841, a paper that's still in operation today. And you wouldn't do that unless you were Jewish. So Mr. Joseph, the first Jew to live in Gateshead. Bernstone had his own ideas, though, and he didn't want to remain a hermit, an outlier. And so at the time, it was quite common practice that missionaries would be waiting on the docks at Newcastle to meet newly arrived Jewish immigrants on the Jewish route. You can say many things about Victorian England. They were certainly very confident in their morals and religious virtues. So anyway, Bernstone, who possibly had his own encounter when he arrived, was appalled at the idea that Jews were being tempted away from the faith as soon as they arrived. And so he took it upon himself to intercept the new arrivals. He would spend an inordinate amount of time on the docks himself, trying to counter the work of the missionaries. And not only that, but he saw a fresh opportunity as well to try and bring some much needed life, Jewish life, to Gateshead. And so as he stepped off the ship, he would try and convince them to move to Gateshead, not Newcastle. And he had certain incentives up his sleeve which helped. So, for example, there was an availability of cheap homes. They'd been built years before as some sort of investment, but for the most part were lying empty. Some were incredibly cheap. The rent was just a couple of shillings a week. He offered interest-free loans, and he by now had a shop that he was operating in Gateshead, and he offered to train some of the men to be glaziers as well. And then, of course, he realized that he'd missed an obvious trick. He'd left some of his family members back in Newcastle. So he crossed the Red Hugh Bridge and dragged them over as well. So he was successful to a point. In fact, a road called Milling Street, which was close to Bernstone's shop, became filled almost entirely with Jewish homes in that era. This is a painting from the late 1970s by an artist called Brian Clew, who was born on the street in 1932. He emigrated to Australia in 1971, so he can't have loved it that much. Maybe there were too many Jews. But anyway, by 1883, Mr. Bernstone had attracted enough family, friends, and immigrants to the area, including 12 Jewish males over the age of 13, to start his own synagogue. Now, you've got to remember, of course, one of the reasons why the Jews were concentrated around Milling Street and around his shop was because on the Sabbath, Jews, practicing Jews, will not get in a car, and therefore the synagogue had to be within easy walking distance. So they're all living in this area, and he starts the synagogue. It wasn't grand. It was a room adjoining a hayloft, but for the sum of 3 pennies each, it served its purpose. And I managed to get this point from the narrative and the story of Gateshead without mentioning the man who, perhaps more than anyone else, put Gateshead on the Jewish map, and his name is Eliezer Adler. Adler was born in 1866 in the part of Europe that changed hands too often to easily associate with a particular country. So right now it's Ukraine, then it was part of the Austrian Empire. He arrived in Liverpool in 1882. If you remember the picture before that I showed of immigrants was from that year, perhaps is in it, as a 15-year-old. But within a few years, he moves to Newcastle. He's supporting his mum, who's widowed, whose father passed away, and is doing what he can to make a living. Unfortunately, in 1887, his mother dies, and being a strictly observant Jew, he decides he's going to say the Kaddish, the prayer that we say honoring close family members that have passed away. And so he's going to say it at every prayer service for the year or for 11 months. So it's quite a hefty commitment. He doesn't approve of standard of observance of the Newcastle Jewish community, and possibly they didn't have the capability to support that commitment with all those prayer services. So he starts walking across the Red Hugh Bridge to join the fledgling Gateshead community. Now, I will say at this point, because I think I have to mention this, and possibly those of you that are familiar with the history of Newcastle and Gateshead will be expecting me to mention this. The Red Hugh Bridge at the time was a penny toll, so to cross it, you had to pay. Now, there were Jews that Bernstone and later Adler convinced to join the Gateshead community, but they were still living in the West End in Newcastle, and so for them it was a walk across the bridge, which was fine most days of the week, but of course on a Saturday, on a Sabbath, we can't carry money. So the story goes that what they would do is they made an arrangement with the toll operator that he wouldn't collect the toll on the Sabbath. They would come back after the Sabbath had ended and pay the penny that they owed during the day when they'd crossed without carrying any money on them. Apparently once a fellow approached him and says, I'm going to pray in the synagogue in Gateshead, so I'll pay after the Sabbath. And the guy says, no, you're not going anywhere. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, it's a Sabbath and you're smoking and you can't smoke on the Sabbath. If you can smoke on the Sabbath, you can have a penny in your pocket on the Sabbath, so pay up. So that's the story. But anyway, so Adler joins this, this movement, as it were, of people that cross the Red Hugh Bridge to pray in Gateshead. He's only a young man. He's just 20 when he starts crossing the Tyne. But by all accounts, he's a supremely talented and driven individual. He had flair for organization that Bernstone lacked, and he really galvanized the fledgling community. In fact, his is the name that's most often associated with the founding of the community, known as the Kehillah, although in the early days it may well have been a Chevra, mentioned before, in keeping with the other similar groups around the UK. And to this day, his chair remains situated in the largest synagogue in Gateshead as his place of honor. So one of the key features of the synagogue is the Ark. The Ark contains the Torah, as I mentioned before. Torah can have a very broad connotation, but here we're referring to the 5 books of Moses. I'll just show you an example. This is the scroll, and you can see it's written in the beautiful calligraphic text. Most scrolls have 248 columns. There are some layout options, not all are exactly the same, but we do have an unbroken tradition of the accuracy and precision of the words, stretching back over 2,500 years, which is quite remarkable. There's almost no variation in any of the scrolls all over the world from any era. Now, if you want to run a synagogue, you need a Torah scroll. Jews pray 3 times a day, and most of our prayers are in the Siddur, the prayer book, but on Monday and Thursday morning, and twice on Shabbat, Saturday, as well as on other occasions, we read from the Torah. Bernstone didn't have and couldn't afford a Torah scroll for what to do. So he first turned to the chief rabbi, Dr. Herman Adler. Dr. Adler suggested that rather than appropriating their own, they should join Leisure Park on the occasions that they needed one, which kind of defeated the whole object of Bernstone and Bernstone's project. So Eliezer Adler, the Gateshead guy, they had chutzpah. And, well, what's chutzpah? Well, it's a Yiddish word that's borrowed from Hebrew that entered the English lexicon about 100 years ago, probably when the comedians in the Catskills were all Jewish and were using it. Chutzpah is a hard word to define, but it contains elements of all of these. It's audacity, it's cheek, it's guts, it's nerve, it's boldness, self-confidence, gall, temerity, and effrontery. If you've got all of that, you've got chutzpah. And Eliezer Adler had lots of chutzpah. But even so, there were limits. And having turned his back on his religious compatriots in Newcastle, there was no way that he was going back to Leazes Park synagogue cap in hand to ask if he could borrow one of their scrolls or to join their service. So he starts looking around for a plan B. And after some time, he finds it. There's a wealthy Jewish manufacturer in Nottingham, whose name we don't have, but he was willing to give them a Torah scroll. Adler was appointed as the man responsible for looking after it. And that's when, despite his bags of chutzpah, he hit upon a problem, perhaps the common sense won out. And that was that the chief rabbi had offered a solution that was perfectly reasonable in the chief rabbi's eyes, and so that was to go to Leazes Park. To use this scroll would be in some way to undermine his authority, and while in time there will be a complete split between the gates of Kehillah and the chief rabbi, that was still in the future. They weren't sure that was the direction they wanted to go. So they decided that in order to function as a synagogue, they would keep the scroll, but they would keep it as a secret. They didn't bother with an ark. They put the scroll into a drawer, and they only removed it on the days when it was going to be read from. And this lasted for a while, not too long, because some of the more devout Jews in Newcastle, who weren't necessarily of the sort that wanted to become outliers and live in Gateshead, but happy in Newcastle, but nevertheless still looking for something perhaps a bit more intense on occasion, would come over to Gateshead when they had Yartzeit, when they were marking the anniversary of the passing of a relative, in order to say the Kaddish prayer that we mentioned before. And they, in their estimation, the Newcastle Jews were sort of recognized that the extra piety of their co-religionists, and so they would come over and pray with the Gateshead crew when they had a Yartzeit. So off goes the warden of the Leazes Park synagogue with the Yartzeit, with the anniversary of passing a relative, and the intention to say Kaddish. And for whatever reason, it was innocuous and innocent, but nevertheless it happened. The scroll is removed from its secret hiding place, and so Anglo Jewry discovers Gateshead's terrible secret. They have a Torah as well. This was a watershed moment because it marked Gateshead's openness to association with external rabbinical authority. The fight that perhaps they were looking to put off for days, weeks, or months was brought much closer by this. And in fact, to this day, it remains a hallmark of the Gates of Kehillah that they don't listen in the same way to external rabbinical authority. I don't talk at all in intention of talking about the position of the Rav, the spiritual leader of the Gates of community. It's a whole there's a lot to talk about, and not for today. But he's the sole arbiter of authority in the community. They're currently between rabbis. The previous one left, and they're waiting to appoint a new one. But meanwhile, to this day, they are independent, and fiercely independent, when it comes to the authority in the town. So Gateshead grew in the early years, not necessarily by leaps and bounds. By 1899, so after approximately 15 years or 16 years, it gets its first mention in the Jewish Yearbook of 1900. At that point, there are 123 members in the Kehillah. And in those early years, the Chesed services, Chesed means kindness. So services like free loan funds, benevolent societies, and charitable groups have also been established. Gateshead is still like an extended family, though, with the synagogue at the very heart of it. It continued to grow through the early part of the 20th century with new educational institutions, the new and somewhat controversial butcher shop. That was another significant departure from the chief rabbi and his authority, and also the acquisition of land in Hazelrig Cemetery, which at least shows you that they had their priorities right. That came a long time after they had the synagogue. And they grow through the 20th century, and through the first part of that, up until the Second World War, Rabbi Eliezer Adler was the dominant figure in town. He never held an official position, but he was everywhere and doing everything. He must have been a phenomenal force to be reckoned with. Anyway, time is running a bit short, so I'm just going to take a stop in 1929 to tell you about Rabbi David Dryan. He was brought to be the rabbi of the community, and at that time it was still talking about maybe a couple of hundred people and some very good, very, very positive services being offered within the community, apart from the religious services. But really, he came with a vision. And perhaps more than Adler, even, he is the man who turned Gateshead into what it is today, because he founded the yeshiva. A yeshiva is a Talmudical college for boys. They normally will go after formal schooling has ended at 15, 16, 17, depending on where in the world they are. They typically attend for 3 years or more, honing their skills in Talmud and study, in knowledge of Jewish law and ethics. Most rabbis, certainly in the Orthodox world, have spent a significant amount of time in yeshiva studying and learning. So anyway, so the one that Dryan founded has gone on to become one of the best in the world. It's also transformed the Kehillah by putting it firmly on the Jewish map. Gateshead became a destination, an aspiration, a dream. Rabbi Dryan was known as the dreamer. And in the wake of his inspiration, other higher educational facilities were opened for boys and for girls, and also for newly married men. So let's fast forward to today, or almost to today. Last time I checked, the Kehillah had some 650 families, many with lots of children. At the beginning of term, approximately 1,200 young men and 800 girls from all over the world arrive at Newcastle Central Station or at the airport, eager and excited to be students in world-class educational establishments. Why am I telling you all this? A short answer, because I think the Gateshead community isn't talked about enough. I live in Newcastle and I'm an outsider to them, but I'm also privileged to have close links with the Kehillah. My 5 children have all gone to school there, and in a reversal of history, people from Gateshead now come to pray in Newcastle, primarily to help keep us afloat, to give us the numbers that we need to keep a quorum. And they also help out for the greatest kindness of all, which is the Chevra Kadisha, the society that manages burial and bereavement services. One of the standout features of the Gateshead community is the way it looks after the people in it. The range of services that every member of the Kehillah can access is astonishing. The success of the kindness organizations have multiplied in step with the growing community, and there's a whole industry in supporting each other through challenges. The challenges may be positive, such as a woman has given birth and her husband needs help with childminding, or when things are not going so well, such as supporting people through financial hardship, physical or mental illness, bereavement, and loss. There's also it's like an undercurrent of acts of kindness as well. That they have what are called gemach. A gemach is a free loan fund, but it doesn't mean financial. It can be anything. So there's a gemach for centerpieces for the wedding. So if you're making a wedding in Gateshead, you don't have to go and buy centerpieces. You can go and choose a centerpiece for the table. There's all sorts of things that people have thought to do and to start, and it really is. It's very special. It's lots of very good people there. So if you want a model of Or LaGoyim, a light to the nations, and we're all, I assume, based here in the northeast, then I'm suggesting we'll go no further than Gateshead. It's a remarkable community, one that's often not understood, but the principles on which it's built and which it functions are clear and should be a source of inspiration to all. Thank you for your kind attention.